Hi, I'm Dr. CS. In this video, we're going to install and configure Git, create a GitHub account, configure GitHub on our local computers so that we can use remote repositories conveniently, and create our first repository. So here I'm at the drcs.codes website. If we go to Professional Python, for example, click on Getting Started, and then click on the Git link here for install and configure Git. Okay, now to install Git for Windows, you follow this link to Git's official downloads page. That's this right here. And click on the 64-bit Git for Windows setup. Now I've already done this, and so go ahead and do that yourself. Download it, and if you need to pause the video, do that, and then come back. Okay. If I open up my File Explorer, go to Downloads, there's the Git installer. Double click on it. Accept the defaults. And go ahead and click on this Add a Git Bash profile to Windows Terminal. That way you'll be able to open up the Git Bash shell in the Windows Terminal. Okay, when you're choosing a default editor used by Git, if you've looked at the instructions for installing Git on Mac OS, I recommended to use VI or Vim because if you're going to use a Unix system, you need to learn at least basic Vim. And most of the time, you're not going to be using it to enter commit messages anyway. You're going to use the -M option to the git commit command on the command line, or you're going to use some text entry in the Git interface in PyCharm, for example. So if you want to change this, go ahead. I'm not going to bother because it doesn't matter. Okay, so this question here pertains to the default main branch of a new repository. Now, GitHub has switched to main for all of its new repositories whenever you create a new repository on GitHub. And Git itself is going to be changing sometime in the future to main. So I recommend going ahead and changing to main. So click on this, leave this as main. And as a bonus, main is easier to type than master anyway. Go ahead and leave this option for the path environment variable as is. Use Git from the command line and also from third-party software. Go ahead and leave this as the default. Leave it as the default. Leave this as the default. Go ahead and leave this as the default. Leave this as the default. Leave these as the default. Okay, go ahead and read that if you want. Okay, now if we launch Windows Terminal, we type Git. It looks like we have it. Okay, and we should also have a profile for Git Bash. So go ahead and click on that. We'll do the remaining setup using Git Bash. So to set up Git, we need to tell Git who we are and what our default editor is. So go ahead and copy this first line. Go over to our Git Bash session, paste it, and then substitute your name inside the quotes. Copy the next one. Enter your email address. And this should be the same email address that you used to sign up for GitHub. And then finally, configure your editor. Never actually going to use this, but it's good to have one configured. And as you can see, there is one available in Git Bash. So you couldn't see the bottom there. So just to show you that again, go escape :Q to quit, assuming that you haven't entered anything. If you've entered some text and you want to discard it, add a bang after the Q. Okay, now to continue with our setup. These two settings here make working with remotes a little bit easier. So I'll just go ahead and copy both of those since we don't need to change them at all. Paste them in, and they'll both get executed. Okay, now we're ready to set up Git. So you should have already set up a GitHub account. So once you've set up your account, the next thing to do is set up your SSH keys. So go to the upper right corner of any GitHub page, click on your profile picture, and then click on Settings. Now under Access on the left-hand side, select SSH and GPG keys. So I already have an SSH key that I set up on my Mac OS machine. I'm actually running Windows within a virtual environment on my Mac OS machine. So now I need to set up an SSH key for Windows running in a virtual machine. So click on this link to generating SSH keys. I'm going to hold down on Control so that it opens up in a new tab. Now you probably won't have created an SSH key before. If you think you have, then go ahead and click on this link. And if you have, then you probably already know what you're doing. So go to this link, generate a new SSH key, and add it to the SSH agent. The Windows instructions are already selected. And from this point, it's very similar to the instructions for Mac OS. So we'll copy this, go to our Git Bash session, paste it, substitute the email address that we configured for Git, go ahead and use that default file location. Now enter a passphrase that is long, easy for you to remember, and hard for other people to figure out. Now if we look at our SSH directory, we'll see that we have our private and public key pair. The next step is to add that key to the SSH agent. So copy this command, enter it in Git Bash, and then add our SSH key to the SSH agent. So copy that command, enter it on the command line. Here we supply the passphrase that we used when we created the key. And now we're ready to add our new SSH key to our GitHub account. So click on that. So what we need to do is copy the SSH public key to the clipboard. So we copy this command here. Now we should have our public key in the clipboard. Now from here, go back to our profile. So I still have this open in another tab. In the upper right corner, click on New SSH Key. And I'm going to call it Horand Win 11 to indicate that this is the key I'm using in my Windows 11 virtual machine on Horand. And for the key, just paste that in, click on Add, and now we should be ready to go. Now if we go back over here to our instructions, click on Test Your SSH Connection, and enter this right here. So we get this warning. To be totally safe, you should check this fingerprint as the instructions say here. So if we look at Git's public key fingerprint, it's this one because we're using this particular encryption protocol here. So if we look at, I'll scroll that down and then move this so I can kind of look at the both of them, and they appear to match. So I'll say yes, go ahead and accept that, and we get the message we want. We've successfully authenticated. That means that we can create Git repositories on github.com, clone them to our local computer, and then push and pull from that remote without having to enter our username and password. Much more convenient. So let's go ahead and do that. So back over in our profile, in the upper right hand corner there's a plus. Click on that and click on New Repository. Come up with a name, something like Python coursework. Now I've already done this for Mac OS, so I'm going to say -Win11. Make it public or private, whichever one you prefer. These are the important things. So you want to click on Add a README file so that GitHub will actually create a repository that you can clone. Go ahead and enter a gitignore template of Python, and then you're ready to go. Create repository. Now on the repository page, click on this green code button. You'll see that SSH is already selected because it knows that we have SSH configured for our account. Click on this copy icon. Now we can go back to Git Bash, or actually we can do this in PowerShell if we prefer. I'll do this in Git Bash. And we need to first create a directory where we want our local clones of GitHub repositories to live. The way I do this, and you don't have to do it this way, but I found that it makes it easy for me to work on any machine that I'm working on because I use the same convention everywhere, is I make a directory called VCS for version control systems. And under that, I have a directory for each remote server where a remote repository lives. And then under that, the username or organization name on that server. So Dr. CS Codes in my case, because that's my GitHub username. Now, this make dir command is not going to work because it assumes that this directory already exists and it's only going to create this directory. So I'll hit the up arrow to go back in my command history and add a -P option. The -P option says make that entire path. So make this directory as well as all the directories above it. Now I can cd to my VCS, github.com, Dr. CS codes subdirectories. I'm typing that so fast because I'm using tab completion. And now I can say git clone and then paste in that Git repository URL that I copied from GitHub. And now I can go into Python coursework Win11. If I do an ls-la, I can see this is the README file that GitHub created for us, and this is the git ignore file that GitHub created for us. And notice that there's also a git subdirectory, or a .git subdirectory. Any Git repository is going to have a .git subdirectory, which tells you that you're in the root directory of a Git repository. Also notice that these dot files on Unix, there's a convention that dot files are so-called hidden files. So if I just do an ls-a, for example, that's list this directory out and give me all the details of the files that are listed, as opposed to just saying ls and then I get a very short directory listing. So if I do ls-a, if I do ls-a, I get everything. If I do ls-l, I don't see the hidden files. All right, so now let's try this out. Let's launch PyCharm. Just to show you something quickly. So this is opening up that default project that we created when we first installed PyCharm. Let's go ahead and load up the project that we just cloned from GitHub. So we'll say new project, but we'll change this location to be the location that we just created. So we'll scroll down to VCS, github.com, Dr. CS codes, and Python coursework Win11. You can just use Python coursework on your machine. So we want to be using virtualenv and use this default, and it automatically found the Python executable for us. Now, we don't want to create this main.py welcome script because we're going to create one of our own. Create the project. Directory is not empty, so we want to create from existing source. And we want to open in this window, which means we're going to replace this other project that's open. If you want to have multiple projects open, you can say new window. Okay. So it opens the README file by default. You can change that if you like. Right-click on the very top on the root and say new Python file. Now, we don't want to put things directly into the root directory. So let's say this is for the intro lesson /hello.py. Now, forward slashes actually do work on Windows. They'll be changed to backslashes in the actual file system. Now, whenever you create a new file in PyCharm, PyCharm is going to ask you if you want to add it to Git, if you're in a project that has a Git repository. You can go ahead and click add normally. Let's just say cancel this time, just so I can show you some Git commands on the command line. So let's just do our hello world. And save it. So there are a number of ways you can run this. You can click on this play button, or you can use the Shift F10 shortcut. Close that. Another way to run it is to open the terminal. Okay, when we open a terminal, we have an error here. And the way to fix that error is actually addressed in the Python documentation for Venv. So if you go to docs.python.org/3/library/venv.html, and then scroll down to this section on creating virtual environments. Down here, there's a note about Microsoft Windows. Set execution policy to this. So copy that. Go back to a PowerShell. And paste it. Now, if we close that and open up the terminal again, we should be all set. And now we have this little Venv indicator here indicating that we are using the virtual environment for this project. Okay, so now I can go into the intro subdirectory because that's where I put it. Notice that we're using backslashes. And if I do a dir, I can see that my hello.py is there. And I can say python hello.py. Hello world. And just for completeness, if we go back to the terminal. So here I'm in Git Bash. Notice that there is the intro subdirectory that we created within PyCharm. We go into that directory and we can say python hello.py and it works. And if we go to the regular PowerShell, here we want to go to bcs github.com. What do we call it? Dr. CS Codes Python Coursework Win 11. And this is the root directory of our Python Coursework Win 11 project. And that's both the Git project and the PyCharm project. And I'll explain this .idea directory in a minute. But if we go into the intro directory, python hello.py, and it runs. All right. So it's important, as I've discussed in the introductory lessons on using the command line in the programming principles course, it's important to remember exactly where you're saving files in the file system. Sometimes people get comfortable in an IDE and they sort of forget that all an IDE is doing is integrating tools for you, like file system access, editors, debuggers, and things like that. All right, but ultimately files are getting saved on your file system. Now, in PowerShell, we can also run that program. So we need to go into the directory where it lives. We do a listing that just happens to work on PowerShell. And we need to go into the intro subdirectory. There's our hello.py. And remember, on Windows, we don't have to say Python 3. And in fact, Python 3, I think, doesn't even work. So wherever in the directions you see, if you're using Windows, if you see in the any directions I have that you should execute Python 3, just execute Python. And don't worry, that is the right version. We do Python-big V, we see Python 3.10.6. Okay, so now we have these new files. Let's go back to our git bash session. Although you can use git, let me just show you this. I'm going to go back to, I'm back in PowerShell. Now I went back with cd ... back to the root directory of the project. If I do a git status, notice that git status works. So this is telling me that I'm on my main branch, and everything that's checked into my local repository is up to date with origin main. What is origin main? So origin main, git remote, let's see, dash v for verbose. So the advantage to creating a repository on GitHub and then cloning it on our local machine is that it set up the remotes for us. So we didn't have to set this stuff up. We already have an origin configured for pushing and pulling. Okay. So in any case, our branch is up to date with origin main. That means it's up to date with what we have in our GitHub repository. But we have some untracked files. So our working directory has things that are not in the Git repository. We need to add them. So rather than adding them here, get in the habit of either using a GUI or using git bash. So I'm going to demonstrate git bash here. So I'm in the root directory of the project. Git status. So we need to add, so the intro directory is where our hello.py is located. So we need to add that. And I'll talk about this .idea directory in a minute. So git add intro / hello.py. I'm using tab completion to type this stuff quickly. Now if we do a git status, we have one new file that is in the staging area. So remember, in Git, there's a two-step process. You have to add things to the staging area, add files to the staging area, then you commit them, then you push them to the remote repository. So, and the advantage to that is that you can add lots of files, and once you have everything ready, you can put things in and take things out of the staging area. And I have links on the website to the free online Git book, which is very good. You can read through that. And once you have all your files in the staging area ready to commit, you can say git commit. Now I'm going to say -m for message and then supply a git message. Add hello.py. Okay, now if I do a git status, now we see that we still have this untracked file. We don't have anything in the staging area, but now it says that our branch is ahead of origin main by one commit. So since the last time I got an update from origin main, I have made one commit, and so now I'm out of sync. So if I go to the website and go to the repository, just hit refresh here just to make sure that I'm getting the latest stuff. I don't see that intro directory. But now that I've made this commit, if I want to push those commits to the remote repository, I do that with git push. And after we do that, we go back to the website, go back to GitHub, we do a refresh. Yeah, we see that we had this commit a minute ago, and there's our intro directory, and there's our hello.py. All right, so go back to the root. All right, now I said I would tell you about this .idea directory. So this .idea directory is a directory created by IntelliJ and PyCharm to hold project-specific settings and indexes and stuff like that. And it's a good idea not to commit that to a repository. One of the reasons it's a good idea to do that is that sometimes you'll have some problems in IntelliJ or PyCharm where the fix for that is going to be to wipe out this directory completely and then let IntelliJ or PyCharm recreate it from sources, like maybe the indexes get out of sync or corrupted or something like that. Okay, so we want to tell Git to ignore that file. So let's go back to PyCharm and let's open up that git ignore file. Don't ask. And go down to the bottom. And add .idea/. And that will tell Git to ignore that directory. So we save that. And now if we go back to our command line and we say git status, it tells us that we have a modified file, the .gitignore, because we just changed that. We just added the .idea subdirectory to it. But we don't see the .idea subdirectory anymore as an untracked file because Git is ignoring it. So now we need to commit that file to the repository and then push it up to the remote. So add it, commit it with the message, add .idea to gitignore, and then push it. This is the same workflow as when we added our hello.py. And now if we go back to our GitHub repository, we refresh it, and we see this latest commit. And if we look at the gitignore file, we'll see at the end of it our update. Okay, so I'll demonstrate using Git for some of the projects in the course. And for now, you have everything you need to get started with Git and GitHub.